We have this breaking news out of the White House. Just moments ago, President Trump made a speech in the White House where he was meeting with Emmanuel Macron of France, saying that he thinks that we are on the cusp of ending the Russia-Ukraine war.
I think the war could end soon.
Well, how soon?
Within weeks.
Weeks?
Yeah, I think so. Right? Don't you think so? I'd like to have you. I think we could end it within weeks if we're smart. If we're not smart, it'll keep going, and we'll keep losing young, beautiful people that shouldn't be dying. And we don't want that. And remember what I said. This could escalate into a third world war. And we don't want that either.
Like we always do, we always look at body language, and Emmanuel Macron is not really that comfortable in that chair. In fact, you may have noticed at the beginning, he was way over to the side, away from where Trump was fidgeting with his hand. So he doesn't seem to be liking that. Not a surprise. As if you were watching our show earlier this afternoon, you saw Gary play some of the video of when Macron arrived. Trump was not there to meet him in front of the White House. It was just some social director or something, and just kind of ushered him into no fanfare. Yeah, that's the one right there. You can see. So not quite the big, showy thing that you might expect from a NATO ally of historic agreement like with France is. But that's kind of consistent with what we've seen here. It can't be a big surprise when Macron and Keir Starmer and many of the old guard in Europe have continued to try to push for an outcome that's very, very different than what Trump is willing to do. And he said some very important things in that opening clip there that I want to camp on here for a second. He said, listen, if this war keeps going, it's just going to end up having more people killed. And so he doesn't want it to get killed. You heard him say over and over there that, listen, all these people are dying, and he's talking about people on both sides of the line. Trump genuinely is concerned about the human casualties in this. I've talked recently to someone who has been in Trump's personal orbit before, and he confirmed that Trump is sincere when he says that, because he actually does care about all these people pointlessly dying. He also said he doesn't want things to go to World War III. So I think he still realizes that even though we are at the cusp of getting this thing over, if we don't do it wisely, and Trump mentioned that, if we do it smart, I think is the way he phrased it, this could go sideways still. And if Europe, and this could also have been a veiled, I won't say threat, but message to Europe as well, and what they're thinking of and what they want to be doing, which could exacerbate things and could actually spawn a conflict with Russia. Russia is very clearly not in a mood to do anything except bring this to a conclusion, but they're going to do it on their terms. I've told you and showed you many times where Trump, just a few days ago, acknowledged that the cards are primarily in the Kremlin's hand. And it doesn't matter what anybody wants or what they wish or what they would prefer to see. There's just not the leverage. Trump is a businessman, and he loves to make good deals, but he's also smart, and he also knows when, hey, I mean, just look at it. If he's looking at it like a deal for some land, he may say, okay, this is just not working here. And this is a money pit, and I'm not going to keep putting good money after bad. We're just going to close this off. He's got a history of doing that. It's in his book, The Art of the Deal. There's many examples of those kinds of things from his mentality, and he's not going to follow a bad course of action just because that's what's been done up to this point, especially if it wasn't him that started it. We've also talked about that as well. But it's especially, if it was a message to Europe, it was probably closer to a warning to the leader of Ukraine, because Zelensky has just been getting more and more on Trump's edge there. And they've been, we showed you in some of our shows last week where there's lots of dueling back and forth comments from Zelensky to Trump, and Zelensky basically saying that Trump was being used by Putin, that he didn't know it, that he was being in a disinformation zone, all this kind of stuff. But Trump fired back that this is a dictator without an election. And if he wants to hang on to his country, he better, get on the board, etc. And so now then you have President Trump saying this war is going to be over with soon. This is actually an acceleration and an advancement, clarification from what the White House press secretary Carolyn Leavitt said over the weekend, that this war could be over this week, that an agreement could be reached in a week, or National Security Advisor Mike Walls this morning on Fox News saying that a deal could be imminent. And now Trump here goes and says, yeah, it could be over in a matter of weeks. We could have a deal quickly. And that's in contrast to what Zelensky is saying. Zelensky had a meeting today with a number of other European leaders, to include Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Union, and a number of other European leaders. And he seemed to be calling out Trump again. Now, we're going to play this clip here, and unfortunately, it's not dubbed into English. You have to read the transcript below, which is an automatic generated through AI. It's a little hard to read, but you're going to see him saying that Putin is going to have to be made to have peace. So it's very much in contrast with what Trump said, but also pay attention to what he says about timing.
Подарує нам цей мир, не віддасть його в обмін на щось. Ми маємо здобути мир силою, мудрістю і єдністю нашою з вами співпрацею. Про мир неможливо просто оголосити за одну годину, неможливо оголосити за один день сьогодні, завтра, післязавтра. На жаль, така реальність. Якщо хтось спробує це зробити, і саме так, без будь-якої опори, це не спрацює, без будь-яких гарантій безпеки. Це
Okay, that's probably not there, Gary. If you couldn't read all that, he's saying basically that Putin has to be made. Going back to language he's used many times, and that peace can only be accomplished by, quote, force and wisdom. He still has some fantasies that there exists some mechanism that either the European Union or President Trump or some combination thereof has the will to even attempt to force anything on Putin, or that they have the capacity to force anything on Putin. It's very clear Trump has been making, overt statements that he recognizes he doesn't have the leverage. But Zelensky seems unwilling to acknowledge that and keeps trying to tell these people. And unfortunately, a lot in Europe are nodding their heads on this because they're going, yeah, that's right. We have to do that. We showed you a comment by Boris Johnson on our show earlier today from this morning, where he's still saying, yeah, just keep on going, keep on fighting, keep on trying to, don't give in on this stuff. It's not British soldiers who were dying, but he seems to keep going on with this. Well, then he moves to even more of a direct contradiction to Trump, because remember, this was coming on the heels of Sunday when Carolyn Leavitt said that an agreement could be made as soon as a week. The National Security Advisor said, yes, this could be very soon, a week or so. And then Zelensky came out on that clip I just showed you and said, and oh, by the way, this is impossible to do in a day or day after tomorrow, et cetera. It's not going to work. And there has to be security guarantees. I'm not asking a question this time. I'm making a declarative statement. He is delusional. He is completely detected or disconnected from reality. You have the President of the United States, after he's been dealing with Russia, he's been calling and talking on the phone to Putin. He has just declared in front of everybody, with the President of France sitting right next to him, that he expects to have a deal open within a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, very near term. And you want to contradict Trump by saying it's impossible, and you want security guarantees, which clearly the United States is in no mood to give and absolutely refuses to do so. And there's been comments by also Mike Walls. It says that there's not going to be any American troops that are going to be used as peacekeepers. They're not going to be done. They're not going to be guaranteeing anything in Ukraine. Yet he still seems to cling to this some fiction. Now, it could be that he's thinking, okay, well, I'll define security guarantees as NATO troops in Ukraine as any kind of a negotiated settlement. It will include NATO peacekeepers, maybe not NATO in form. You've heard Secretary of Defense Hegseth say there won't be any Article 5 guarantees. There won't be any American soldiers part of this, but it may be possible. Well, as it turns out, that's also something Trump talked about, because he's said not only is there a possibility of this coming to a head pretty soon, but Zelensky himself will be here to sign the deal.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office. So the agreement's being worked on now. They're very close to a final deal. It'll be a deal with rare earths and various other things, and he would like to come, as I understand it, here to sign it, and that would be great with me.
Did you see anything in Zelensky's demeanor in that clip I just showed you from earlier today that he thinks he's on the cusp of signing an agreement? You also saw, if you watched our show earlier today, I recommend you go back onto our list of shows there and watch this one. It's got a lot of interesting information in it, one of which is on the whole issue of these rare earths. Trump said there again that I think we have a deal with the rare earths. Everything's good to go. Zelensky just said, yeah, there's no deal. And what you think was a deal, these $500,000 or $500 million of a deal, I'm not even going to give you $100 billion. So he is contradicting Trump on everything that you can imagine. So this sounds more like Trump is getting closer to a point to where he's going to say, you either come to my desk and you sign the document that I'm going to give you to end this war, or I think he's getting into a position where he's going to say, you're on your own then. You can figure it out. You want to go to all these European friends? You want to see what they'll do for you? Good on you. Good luck. You'll do it without us, without our money, without our troops, and without our support. I think that Zelensky is getting into a place because you see, he is just, every time you turn around, he is contradicting what Trump is saying. And as we've talked about, Trump is not one who puts up well with being contradicted by somebody, especially somebody who he considers his inferior. Well, let's talk about that issue of peacekeepers, because that could be a fly in the ointment, even of getting an agreement done with the Russian side. Here's what Trump said at that same press conference about peacekeepers.
To accept the European troops as peacekeeper, what do you think?
Yeah, he will accept that.
He will accept
I've
it?
asked him that question.
You talked to me?
I've asked him that question.
Is
Said
France
yes?
going to lift the block on the
Because
300
he's
billion?
not, look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for more war. He doesn't mind, but I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it.
And the devil's in the details. Did President Putin say to Trump that he's okay with European peacekeepers, or just with he's willing to contemplate peacekeepers in concept, generally speaking? Because I've seen a number of comments, because obviously I pay a lot of attention to the Ukraine, to the Russian side of the news, to the Ukraine side of the news, the European side of the news. I try to get this from all the different angles to see what people are saying and what they think on their side. The Russian side has been pretty adamant that they are open to the possibility. Putin actually did say this, that he is open to the possibility of some kind of peacekeepers somewhere in there. But they were very clear on where they can't come from. They can't come from NATO countries. And in fact, in this press conference that Sergei Lavrov had on the 18th of this month, so just about a week ago, he said that, listen, we were clear with our counterparts that President Putin has repeatedly emphasized that NATO expansion and absorption of Ukraine was a direct threat to the interests of the Russian Federation and our sovereignty. Considering this, the troops from NATO countries in Ukraine under a foreign flag, an EU flag, or any national flag does not change anything in this regard. This is unacceptable. The only thing that they have even opened the door to is the possibility of some non-European peacekeepers. So if Zelensky thinks he's going to get European peacekeepers, if Europeans think that they're going to get European peacekeepers, they may all be very much surprised, because the Russians are saying, look, this is just not going to fly at all. So it's unclear if maybe something's changed. Obviously, I don't know anything about what the conversation was between Putin and Trump. Perhaps he has changed. That was a week ago that Lavrov said that. But it's been pretty clear what they've said from the beginning, that it doesn't matter what form NATO soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, between them and Russia, basically up to Russia's border, what would be Russia's border in any agreement, is something that they adamantly oppose. They said that's the reason they went to war in the first place, and they're certainly not going to sign a deal now that will literally put them on their doorstep. So we'll have to see how that plays out. There was one other potential conflict in what Trump was saying and what the Russians are saying, and that is on the issue of a ceasefire. This is what Trump also said today.
I'd like to go directly to an agreement, but ceasefire will always happen a little bit quicker. And every day you're saving thousands, or at least hundreds, but thousands in some cases lives. So we want to see if we can get that done.
Yeah, about that too, though. Is there going to be a ceasefire? Because everything that we've shown you so far from the Russian side has said they're not interested in a ceasefire. They're going to continue to fight. And in fact, Sergei Lavrov reinforced that today when he said on RIA Novosti, the Russian government-approved news site, that the president clearly said that we are ready to negotiate with Ukraine and with Europe and with representatives who in good faith would like to help achieve peace, but we will stop hostilities only when those negotiations give a firm, stable results that suits the Russian Federation. Of course, the realities on the ground have to be taken into account. They have set for themselves, and we talked about this a number of times, the 14 June line set by Putin last summer, which was the administrative borders of the 4 oblasts at a minimum, and several other conditions as well. You've seen Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, has said a week or so ago that no negotiated settlement will end unless all of Putin's conditions are met, all of them. And now here today you have Lavrov reinforcing that they will not stop fight. They're not going to settle for a ceasefire, because they have said repeatedly that they said that all that would do is buy time for the Ukraine side, give them a chance to catch their breath, give the Western allies a chance to continue to send more weapons, long-range missiles, artillery ammunition, train people, etc. And they said all that would do is potentially raise the cost of us if the negotiations don't work. So they said, we're not going to do that. I think they mean that. I think that they're clear that Trump may want a ceasefire, but I would be shocked if the Russian side actually agreed to a ceasefire without a firm commitment of a negotiated settlement already agreed upon. We'll see how that works out. But that could be a real point of contention because, listen, President Trump said it, and he's right when he said it last week, and it's certainly right today. Russia has the cards. They have the military capacity. And you just look at the battlefield dynamics. You have Russia is continuing every single month to get stronger and bigger. They have forces. They have so many forces that they can rest entire divisions of men, whole groupings of them. They can come and fight in the front for a while and then rotate out and then bring fresh troops back in who have been trained. In the meantime, they're training outside here. Those that go back, then they rest and refit. Then they get replacements. Then they train some more. And then later on, they would come back in. So they have this constant rotation of fresh troops. They don't get worn out at the front. On the Ukraine side, the opposite is happening. They don't get anyone rotated off. They don't have enough troops to move from one place to another. So when there's a buckling of the line here, if they want to try and reinforce it, they have to weaken another part of the line to bring it in because they just don't have enough. Probably worse than that is the morale issue. And this works in opposite directions on both sides. Now, imagine you're the Ukraine army. You're reading the news. You got Telegram, you got Twitter, you got normal news feeds. You can see what's going on in Washington. You can see what's going on in the West. You see these comments coming from Trump. The war is over. He's now been saying it's going to be, weeks or days. How eager are you going to be to sacrifice your life today when you know that the war could be over in a matter of weeks? All you want to do at this point is survive. You know the war is over. You know it's lost. 100% guaranteed. No room for any confusion on this point. So what if the war drags on? What if Zelensky doesn't agree to it and doesn't want to take the deal that Trump is offering and the war continues? How eager do you think these guys are going to be to fight, especially if Trump is true to his word and cuts off the support and says, we're not going to give you anything else. You're on your own with Europe. I mean, the morale would just go even further into the basement. And there is a very real possibility that as time goes on, the chances of a collapse of the Ukraine government, of the Ukraine military, will continue to rise. This is balanced or offset on the other side by moving the opposite direction. The Russian side, their morale, from what I can be able to read through Telegram and some other sources, is through the roof. And it makes sense. You don't have to have any sources. It makes sense. You've been fighting this war forever. You also see what Trump is saying. You also see what has been happening on the battlefield. You see that your numbers continue to grow by the month. You see that you have the resources, you have the food, you have the ammunition, you have the supply, you have the logistics, you have the ability to rotate troops off the line, and you see your side is winning. And you see we are on the cusp, the Russians would say, we are on the cusp of having defeated the best that the West has to offer, that they 50 nations that they bragged all the time have been fighting up against us. And all of these, whatever it is, the true number is 800,000 active Ukraine army to this day. Everything that we've given them, training, support, ammunition, intelligence, all of those things. Russia is on And it is going to be a huge psychological success for them. And so they are pressing even harder, not unlike what happened in 1945 when the Soviet army was closing in on Berlin. And they all knew that the end was coming, and they fought more fiercely. Whereas the Ukraine side right now, it's human nature that they're going to be risk averse and trying anything they can not to be the last one to die, not to die in the last few days of this war so that they have a chance to live. And you have on the Russians the opposite side. They are pressing eagerly forward. They want to get into the fight quickly, and they want to press it even more because you see it. You've seen it in sports. When one side just starts driving the other down, they get more fierce, they get more focused, and they drive harder. It's not any different here. That's why I say that if Zelensky doesn't agree to this deal that Trump's calling him basically to the carpet for, they could end up having a military defeat and just get terms of surrender that Trump won't have anything to say about, because Ukraine will just, their military could collapse and Russia could just drive up to the Dnieper River should they decide to do so. That's the point we're in right now. You see, this is the reality. Take the emotion out of it. What I've just described to you is an accurate assessment of the balance of forces in this war and where they are now. In the last minutes that we have here, though, I want to take a look at how we got to this place, because as I just mentioned here, whereas the Russians feel like they're on the cusp of winning something, we on our side are on the cusp of a loss that the ramifications of which have not been considered. Too few people are even aware of what's at stake here. And unfortunately, if we have that second course, which is where the Russians continue on, Ukraine doesn't agree to a deal, and their military collapses and the Russians win a military victory, we don't even contemplate that as a possibility. But you need to, because the emotional problems that's going to cause us is going to take away a lot of our security. It's going to add a lot of feelings of insecurity. And we're going to wonder, are we even safe anymore? And people are going to be really afraid, because they're going to say, hang on, we've been told ad nauseum, especially last summer, right here in Washington, D.C., where I'm at, that NATO is the greatest defensive alliance in the history of mankind and is stronger and more unified today than it's ever been. That's what they said last summer. And then you're going to tell me less than a year later, everything you did failed? And despite you're telling me that you were going to harm Russia, that they ended up winning and are now stronger than before? The question is, how did we get to this point? Where were there egregious issues? Now, today is the third anniversary of the war. And so it started on 24 February 2022. And now then here we are at the 3-year mark. And I'm not going to go through a big, long history of the war, but I'm going to show you a handful of key moments which I think historians will go back and look at and say were absolutely decisive in building up for ourselves in the West the loss which we are on the verge of suffering right now. And let's start off at the very beginning. This is Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in April of 2022. Shortly after the Istanbul agreement that could have ended the war and ended our loss and prevented it from ever happening, we rejected that and instead decided to keep fighting. And in the aftermath of that, in a lot of the euphoria and kind of an in-your-face, yeah, we're going to keep fighting, here's what Blinken said was our strategy.
The strategy that we've put in place, massive support for Ukraine, massive pressure against Russia, solidarity with more than 30 countries engaged in these efforts, is having real results. And we're seeing that when it comes to Russia's war aims, Russia is failing, Ukraine is succeeding.
Okay, that was a theme that you heard almost all the way through this war. They finally stopped doing it about a half a year or so ago. Russia is losing, Ukraine is winning. We're going to succeed. They have failed in all of their war aims, you were relentlessly told. And you have the Secretary of State of the United States of America saying this with such emphasis. I could have shown many from Joe Biden himself, who said in Poland, I think it was, barely a month into the war, maybe it was even less than that Russia is not going to win. Ukraine is going to win. Russia's going to lose, he said. Do you remember that infamous place where Biden ad-libbed and said, my God, this man can't remain in power? I mean, it's not lost on a lot of people, especially on the other side of the line, that Joe Biden defiantly said that he can't stay. Putin can't stay. He has to go. And now Biden's gone and Putin's still there. And now then Ukraine hasn't won. Ukraine is on the cusp of losing. That is playing through the minds of quite a few people right now. And as time goes on, I think the West is also going to go back when they do a post-mortem all this, and it's just going to get a lot of cringes. Okay, so that was the strategy. We're going to provide Ukraine with a lot of stuff, and we're going to do what we can to like sanctions and whatever to harm Russia as best we can. Didn't say anything about how that's going to translate into victory, but that's just a strategy, so he called. Well, we did have from Secretary of State Austin, actually at that same conference there in April 2022, he was talking about why the Ukraine side's going to win it all.
In terms of their ability to win, the first step in winning is believing that you can win. And so they believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. They can win if they have the right equipment, the right support. And we're going to do everything we can, continue to do everything we can to ensure that that gets there.
Honestly, that sounds like something you'll hear at a pep rally, maybe at Disneyland, something like that. Gee, fellas, the first step in winning is believing you can win. I mean, that sounds like something you say to Pop Warner football kids or something like that. And in sports, yeah, that is true. You got to first believe you can win before you're going to. But beyond, child games, that doesn't work in war. And the thing that troubled me at the time, and especially now looking back on it, is his comment that they believe they can win and we believe they can win. Now, historians will have to find that because I don't have access to anybody who is behind the scenes here, so I can't really say what they actually thought. I don't know whether Secretary of Defense Austin believed what he said, that he believed Ukraine could win, or whether he didn't believe it but thought, we can, as long as we can hurt Russia, I guess it's cool anyway. I don't know which it is because, and let me actually play that one. Subsequently, he said if Blinken told you what the strategy is, Austin later said what the objectives are.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability.
So I believe Ukraine can win, and our objective is to weaken Russia. Let's examine that there. Now, I will tell you, and I did at the time, that was never true. Whether he believed it or not, historians will have to find out. And I'm sure that memoirs will come out and people will say behind the scenes what was going on, and then we'll find out for sure what did happen. But I can tell you, no matter what was said, the truth was always evident that Ukraine was never going to win the war. Russia came out and made a big mistake. They took a gamble. It wasn't completely without historical precedence or some chance of success, which was that they wanted to roll into the country from, I think it was a total of 5 different axes of advance in the north, the east, and the south, to basically terrify Zelensky and his government into capitulating right then and there and agreeing to a negotiated settlement that would be very similar to what the Minsk Accords were that they wouldn't implement before. That was what the Russians apparently attempted. Problem is they were manned for Plan A, which was that one. But when the Ukraine side didn't follow their side of Plan A, which was capitulating, instead they fought fiercely and heroically and viciously. Russia wasn't manned for Plan B. So they didn't have a Plan B, and they definitely didn't have the personnel for it. So now then they're stuck, and they have to try to figure out what to do with these forces that they already had. They don't have enough ready to actually conquer the country, so they have to start playing for time. They immediately pulled, not immediately, but within a number of weeks, pulled nearly all of their troops from north of Kiev, north of Sumy and Kharkiv area. They pulled them all back to the Donbass because that was always the most important issue right there. So they said, all right, well, let's take what forces we do have, try to get a negotiated settlement, but at the minimum, let's make sure we are able to conquer the Donbass area. So that's what they did. But now then they don't even have enough troops to do that either. So now they've got to go figure it out and get the troops to do that. Here's the problem. people like Blinken and Austin and Zelensky and all kinds of other British leaders at the time, Macron in France, they mistakenly thought this shows that Russia is weak and that they're bad and can be defeated. It did show that they were weak. It did show that they made some bad, both strategic and operational decisions. I agree with that. I've never said anything besides that. But you have to look at the strategic look, and you have to do the balance of power at the national level. And when you do that, when you did that, when Russia had made its errors and when they had discovered their mistake in not equipping themselves for a plan B, you still had these dynamics that were out of balance. So Russia historically has made a lot of blunders at the beginning of war. This is not new for them. But they have also almost always been able to overcome that in time. Certainly that was the case in World War II, where the Nazis came in and drove them thousands of kilometers back and caused millions of casualties. But even then, they discovered how big and copious Russian is that they could absorb that massive number of losses and then be able to retool, rebuild, and then turn the tide and come back in the other direction. The same dynamics that existed in the USSR, for the most part, exist for Russia today. The USSR was multiple other countries that are now, many of which are not in the Russian Federation, but the bulk of the Russian Federation and its country itself was the primary driver in the manpower, the natural resources, the industrial capacity, and as it turned out, some of their key allies as well. All of those things were still in the evidence, even when they had made tactical and operational errors, but they could recover from it. So everyone should have recognized that. One man did for a while and said something, and that was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, in November of 2023, when he recognized it and said, hey, this is probably the best you're ever going to get. This would be a great time to do diplomacy. Had anyone listened to him then, you would have been able to make a deal that was relatively favorable to Kiev compared to anything they would ever get after that. But again, according to the New York Times about a month or so ago, Anthony Blinken himself shot that down. He rejected the advice of the general and instead said, no, we're going to keep fighting. And now then we have the disaster on top of us that we do. And while Milley made some good moves in 2022, then no one listened to him. So they were said, all right, they got appetite. Their eyes got too bigger than their stomach. And they said, let's do even more. Let's go on an offensive in 2023, the following year, and drive those Ruskies out. That's what they wanted to do. I argued against this because Russia had already started learning very quickly from their mistakes of not outfitting for a plan B, and they started coming up with one really quick. Well, one of the first things they did is something that Russia has historically been really good at, and that's building defenses. So they started almost immediately constructing a whole lines of what they call the Surovikin defense, which turned out in some areas to be 5 lines of defenses, which mutually reinforcing positions, etc., millions of mines, engineering fortifications, pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire, etc., something really difficult to get through. I had trained when I was on active duty in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry back during the Cold War when we were still patrolling the east-west border before the wall had even come down. And I knew what it would take for an armored force to get through a prepared Russian defenses. And I knew Ukraine had none of the stuff that you would need to do that. Primarily, they didn't have an engineering support. They didn't have enough air power. They didn't have air defense, and they didn't have the trained personnel. Other than that, it was a toss-up. There was no chance for it. Why is it that our senior leaders didn't get that? Why is it that some people who, and I'm just going to pick one out of thin air, not really, David Petraeus, former 4-star general, who to this day still has a reputation for being a hero in Iraq, and he had all the inputs ready to save us in Afghanistan too, but only them politicians sabotaged that and moved it out. Then he became the CIA director, etc. Why is that guy still listened to? Because here's what he said on the eve of the launching of this offensive operation.
I believe that we'll see for the first time in this war on either side the achievement of true combined arms effects. In other words, the results of tanks protected by infantry against anti-tank guided missiles, artillery and mortars keeping the enemy's heads down, engineers reducing the obstacles, breaching these fortifications that the Russians have established, air defense keeping the Russians off the Ukrainians, electronic warfare jamming the Russians' already inadequate command and control facilities, and all orchestrated by very, very good Ukrainian command and control, and also using drones out over the Russians to attack them in depth with the precision munitions that the U.S. and U.K. and others have provided. And this, I think, is going to break the front lines. And noting that on the Russian side, this is a force that has been battered, that many of these units have been in constant combat for well over a year. They're not pulling units offline and reconstituting them. In other words, replacing the losses, the people, the equipment, and retraining them. They're just adding people to the front lines. That's not the way you produce a cohesive, coherent, well-disciplined organization. And I think, therefore, that's why they're going to crack, crumble, and perhaps actually collapse.
Now, that's a lot longer of a clip than I normally show, but I did that on purpose because I wanted to really reinforce here something. So you had David Petraeus on the eve of this offensive operation tell that BBC reporter in detail why the Ukraine side would succeed and why the Russian side would fail. And he was nearly wrong about everything. And it's not like after the fact you can, Monday morning quarterback it and say, well, he was wrong and he was dumb. I wrote almost 2 months before that statement was made that this offensive had almost no chance of success. And I said, even if it had some outlying tactical success, it would still be a strategic failure no matter what, but that it probably would even fail to accomplish that. And I was very specific in my own article about why that is. And it turned out because what I just said, the Ukraine side had virtually no air force. They had no air cover. We would never have attempted such an operation without air superiority, if not air supremacy. They didn't have the engineering support. They didn't have enough armor. They had some, but they didn't have enough. And most critically, more critically than all of that, they didn't have the trained manpower, because that stuff can't be created in 2 or 3 months of training like they tried to do. You need years, multiple years of building a force, training with it, growing the different leaders at the different echelons of company, battalion, brigade, up the strategic level, division level or so, corps level. You have to have people at each of these levels in the way that they were organized to fight there in this combined arms situation. And the arms have to be coordinated to work together. They have to have trained and put the field training exercises and then studied and gone to classroom stuff even on. You got to do all that to have a shot at defeating a dug-in enemy outward. That is the most difficult path. The offensive that you can do is to unseat a dug-in enemy. We asked them to do the most difficult thing that they could do when they had almost none of the advantages necessary to have a shot. So the question has to be asked. Why did David Petraeus not know that? And then on the Russian side, he said the same thing. He listed this whole reason why that they weren't succeeding and why they had bad leadership and all this. These were myths. These were marketing kinds of deals. We wanted the Russians to look bad, so we just said they were bad. Well, the truth is they were already making a lot of improvements, especially since General Surovikin had arrived on the scene. He took some hard operational decisions, like he gave up the city of Kherson without a fight because he said it would be more expensive to hold it than to give it. It was a huge PR and media celebration for the Ukraine side. The West cheered and celebrated. The Russians took their licks. They went back about their business, but they started making fundamental changes. And instead of recognizing that they were doing that, instead they just, like Petraeus, would just mock them and say they can't do it, making up failures that didn't actually exist. Well, that works for media. It definitely worked on, I think it was May 31st of 2023. Everybody believed him. But see, so few people actually go back and look at what happened and said, hey, hang on. You said they were going to succeed here, and it was an abysmal failure. It didn't just fail. It's not like two teams were evenly pitted and, well, one eventually won the other day because things just didn't go their way. This was like an obliteration, a destruction from day one that the Ukraine side suffered these losses, which were entirely predictable. And how come these guys didn't know that? So now then you've seen, we're built in a case here. You have the President of the United States, Joe Biden, who has said we're going to stay as long as it takes. and we're going to provide, and Ukraine is going to win, Russia is going to lose. Declarative statements. Yet the Secretary of State lay out this strategy. We're going to give a bunch of stuff to Ukraine, and we're going to put a lot of pressure, massive pressure is the word he used, on the Russian side. You had the Secretary of Defense say, yes, and we're going to give all this stuff, and we're going to assemble all these nations that are going to work together, and we're going to have this Normandy format, they called it, and just keep giving all this stuff. And we want to weaken, our objective is to weaken Russia. Then you have some of our generals that are saying, yep, they're on the right path, the Ukraine side is, and they're going to definitely beat the Russian side, so much so, he said, that they may crumble and collapse. The Russian defense could collapse, and the Ukraine could have gone all the way to the Sea of Azov. I could have put General Ben Hodges in, who at the same time, actually months before that, was saying that Russia was going to end up surrendering Crimea, that Ukraine troops would be in Crimea by August of that year. He repeated it in July, even after it was clearly evident that all the offensive operations had failed. He still kept saying that. People still kept listening. They still keep putting microphones in his face, and they keep giving him credibility. I didn't even have a chance to look at it, but I saw that he had a video out a couple of days ago where he was interviewed, and he's still saying some of these same kinds of nonsense. And I keep wondering, why do y'all put him on there when, I mean, it's embarrassing to whatever network it's on, because he doesn't, it turns out to be completely false. And I just kind of want to wrap a bow around this, because just last month, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who I showed you in one of those first clips at the beginning of the war, was all optimistic and stuff. Now, you might think, okay, optimism is one thing. I get it. But now then you have the truth of it. President Trump was elected, promised to end the war. Everything he's doing is getting set up. All the things that he's saying, he's still going to do it. He's going to have a negotiated settlement to end the war. So you would think that your valedictory speech, your graduation speech that you're going to say just before you leave the stage, and this turned out to be about 10 or 11 days before he left office, you had the Secretary of Defense one more time repeat fiction.
So this coalition has become the arsenal of Ukrainian democracy. It has become an engine of global security. And this contact group has become the most consequential global coalition in more than 30 years.
The most consequential global coalition in 30 years. The arsenal of democracy for Ukraine. That has succeeded. I'm running out of superlatives to use of what planet is this guy from, delusion, all those kind of things. None of those seem fitting anymore. How can you say this with all these cameras rolling, recording it for posterity, when any look at the actual battlefield shows just defeat after defeat after defeat, and the Russian army making advance after advance after advance, even while he's talking. And all of these things that they tried, the offensive in 2023, and then attempts at defense everywhere from that day forward, from I think it was November 2023 forward to this day, Russia has been on the advance, and because of the reasons I just articulated a minute ago, with the rotating fresh troops, training and mobilizing and getting people, having the defense industrial base, all of those things, the air power, the air defense, the drone superiority, all of those things, you still want to say that, wow, we did great stuff. 1 million Ukraine potentially is dead. This laughable figure of 43,000, it was announced by Ukraine earlier today, is embarrassingly, it's not even laughable. It's so grotesque and so dishonoring to the Ukrainian men who have actually given their lives. It's probably close to 1 million people, could be a little bit more. It could be 1.5, 2 million wounded on top of that. Scores of thousands have lost limbs and will be maimed for the rest of their lives. PTSD, nobody has a clue what that is, but it's got to be astronomical. And it's something that the Ukraine country is going to be dealing with for a generation. I mean, for 50, 60 years into the future, until these guys die off. It's going to be affecting a lot of people for a long time. No concept of that. No recognition that our policies produced this. Yes, Russia, I've done a show on this before. They had an alternative short of war they could have used in February 22, but they didn't use it. And the problem is it was predictable that they weren't going to go peacefully. They signaled that they would use force, and all we had to have done was taken NATO advancement off the table for Ukraine. There were other things that could have been negotiated, but that was the core issue for the Russian side. It always was. Russia used that in their declaration when they said they were starting their so-called special military operation. Lavrov repeated it again this morning. It's never been anything different. We could have prevented the war by just acknowledging reality. We could have ended the war early on in this by acknowledging reality. We could have ended the suffering after the 2023 failed offensive. We didn't do it. We could have ended it in the summer of 2024 when Putin made another offer for peace in June 14th on that. That's what I keep referring to. We didn't take it. And now here we are. You see that these guys are all unrepentant. They keep saying, you may recall we put in here in early January, Secretary Blinken had a similar comment there. We set up Ukraine for success. We have them on the road to standing on their own and all this kind of stuff. No truth to it at all. And you see that clip I showed you from Zelenskyy earlier today. You have all these leaders sitting around there around that table. They're still trying to talk about ways of how they're going to somehow get a deal that's beneficial to Kiev. Totally disconnected from reality. And we are going to pay for this one day. I hope that Trump keeps, to his guns here and ends this war next week. That would be fantastic. I don't care what the terms are. They can be terrible for Kiev. They're going to be terrible for Kiev because they can be nothing else short of that right now. Because here's the thing, let me just preempt a lot of the arguments that are going to come because they've already started doing some of it. It's going to be Munich, 1938, all over again. You can see the headlines already coming in now. If Trump gets what he wants off the table, then that's going to be the cheat. But let me just tell you why that's a lie or incredibly lack of knowledge, because the conditions that existed in 1938 aren't even comparable to anything right now, the least of which because we have NATO, France has nuclear weapons, UK has nuclear weapons, of course, the United States has nuclear weapons, Russia has nuclear weapons. This is not going to be a repeat that once Ukraine falls, now all of a sudden the rest of Europe is going to fall too. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. There is no Munich agreement. It's not capitulation. It's acknowledgement of reality. Something that the European Union, something that these people who will make this 1938 argument are incapable of acknowledging. They cannot acknowledge reality. They're going to grasp some kind of fiction. If their version of fiction somehow infects Trump and he gives in to any of this pressure, for example, I doubt that he'll do it. But if it did, they would be committing yet more generations of Ukrainian men to certain death for a certain failure. They would see Ukraine physically defeated on a battlefield instead of, quote, giving Putin what he wants, which is the claim they're using right now. Trump is not giving Putin what he wants. Putin is taking what he can because he has the military capacity on the battlefield to take it. Trump isn't giving anything away. He's acknowledging reality, and his actions will, as he said in that clip I showed you at the beginning, save Ukrainian lives. Volodymyr Zelensky is incapable. He won't do it. Ukrainian leaders are incapable. They won't do it. Trump is the only one who can actually save the lives of Ukrainian people who are alive right now as I'm making this video. If any of these other leaders get their way, potentially hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainian men will pointlessly die in a war that's already over. That's the stark reality of it here. And I think that history is going to be very, very cruel to the Western leaders who have facilitated this all the way through. It is going to be ugly for Ukraine. There's no way around that. But it can get a lot worse if we don't take this ugly loss right now. It could get a lot worse. I pray that Trump stays firm to his convictions and that one way or the other, this war ends really, really soon. That would be the best news for the Ukrainian people who are still alive today. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate you. We are uncompromised, and we are going to give you the truth no matter what it is. It doesn't matter because you deserve to know it, and those Ukrainian people deserve to live. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.